Oh, I'm supposed to wait until he tells me. Are you ready? Yoo-hoo, camera crew, are you ready? Okay, yung gawin na. Takatuhan, yik a tutat, yik a yi tutat, suhakakewu. Good morning. As always, we give thanks to the Shkatquan people. We're on the traditional lands of the Stakeen-Kwan people. This morning, we are doing some heavy stuff, and I'd like to thank everybody for being here. And the one thing is thanking Sharing Our Knowledge Conference for being here in Wrangell and sharing the knowledge with the people here and with the people who came, all of you. This morning, September 10th, Disyadi moon month, small moon month, Sandikatsku, Saturday. The boarding school experience. The keynote this morning will be by Mr. Jim LaBelle. Let's put the specs on. Break the silence, let the healing begin. Jim LaBelle Sr. Inupiaq is Vice President of the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition. He attended the Wrangell Institute and Mt. Edgecumbe High School, where he learned about European and American history and language, math, and science, but learned nothing about Indigenous cultures and traditions. Quote, I didn't know who I was, he says in this presentation. Jim will tell of his boarding school experience and emphasis the importance of letting the healing begin. So here's Mr. LaBelle.
Well, good morning.
Good morning.
As you probably noticed, I'm a lot older today than you saw in the video. It was my good fortune to help the producers of this video, Our Spirits Don't Speak English, by recruiting some Alaskans to contribute to the documentary. And I knew all of them. One has since passed away, Rose Prince. I wanted to formally introduce myself. My name is Jim LaBelle. My ancestry goes to Kotzebue and Norvik. My Inupiaq name is Akpayuk. Can you say Akpayuk? It means fast runner. Well, not anymore. I was named after an uncle who had passed away before me, and it is our cultural way to be named after someone in order to keep the memory of this person with us. There's so many things that we can go in so many different directions, but what I'd like to do is kind of feed off the video that we just saw. I'd like you to know that everything that you more or less seen in this video happened right here at Wrangell Institute. I attended Wrangell as an 8-year-old, and I was here for 6 years, from 1955 to 1961. And from my dad was white, and my mother was Eskimo, of course, and I believed I could speak both Inupiaq and English pretty well. But after coming to Wrangell and seeing the punishment that other children who only spoke their language received, I decided to not speak any of my language because I did not want to get punished. I did not want to get beaten. I didn't want to be thrown in a closet. I didn't want to be thrown in a gauntlet, although I went through a gauntlet as a child. It's amazing. Wrangell, for some reason, as an institute, at least in the boys' dorm, we're very fond of stripping us boys naked from the get-go. In fact, on our first day of arrival, in the receiving room, we were told to, all of us that were there, told to get undressed until we were totally naked, and we were standing in front of other children we did not know. I did have my younger brother with me, so at least I knew him. But here we were, children as young as 5 years old, 6, 7, 8, 9, and on up, all standing on this concrete floor without any clothes on. And little children who had trouble understanding the commands were often at the consternation of matrons that would run over to that little child and just literally ripped his clothing off. And that was a sign to other children that they better take off their clothes or experience what this other child received. And it was all done with a lot of silence. Most of the time our heads were down. We were afraid to look at people. We were afraid to be singled out in any way. And the very first thing they did was put us in a line, and we were to face a barber that was at the other end of the room. And I remember being toward the end of the line, and as we were getting closer to the barber, I saw the hair piling up around his feet, as all of the children were getting their haircuts shorn all the way to practically we were bald as children. The next thing we did was be sent up to the place to get a shower, and a lot of children never had seen bathing like this. We have to think about many of the children that were at Wrangell came from tundra communities where there were absolutely no mountains, no trees, and now they were hundreds and hundreds of miles away in an alien environment and being told to disrobe and bathe themselves when most of them did not know how to do that. In the shower, another matron would use another little child as an example by taking a floor brush with lye soap and scrubbing this little child until parts of his skin bled. And we watched this happening before us, and we decided, I think we're going to try the best we can to clean ourselves, because we did not want to face a scrubbing like this other child did. We were issued, this is where we were all issued our numbers, and it came in the form of government-issued clothing. By the way, everything that we came with us was taken away and burned, like you saw in the video. And this new clothing had a two-digit number marked on our shirts and shorts and pants and socks. And that number stayed with us for the entire year. It was a way to identify us when when our clothes got dirty. They put them in the laundry, and they could send these clothes back to the rightful child. And heaven help you if you forgot your number. I I was, of course, there for 6 years, and I have 6 two-digit numbers that I have a hard time looking at. I went to the National Archives and found 80 pages of information about myself as a child from Wrangell Institute. And there's some things I just gloss over because I don't want to spend too much time for fear it'll just send back those memories. But the numbering system was interesting because a lot of children had difficult names to pronounce. And it was easier for matrons to call children by their number rather than by their name. And so consequently, a lot of kids, much later in life, would often tell the story about how, for a while, they thought that their number was their name. Imagine that for a while. Their number was their name. 88, get over here, 88. It was on the mail. It was on our clothing. When we first got to our dorm rooms, it was a military-style barracks like the one you saw in the video. In fact, I want to digress a little bit and tell you that Sheldon Jackson was a dear friend of Colonel Henry Pratt. They were friends. In fact, Sheldon Jackson spent an entire year with Pratt at his house. And together they developed this system of boarding school. So at least you think that boarding school began with Pratt. It really began in many respects with Sheldon Jackson. And when I did my master's paper on my experiences of boarding school, I quoted Sheldon Jackson as saying that it was very much in his interest to civilize the savages. And as you know, Sheldon Jackson lived here in Sitka, or in Southeast, and his own frame of reference at the time were basically Tlingit and Haida and Tsimshian. So my guess is that he may have been referring to all of us as savages. And he said, for the others, we'll send them to boarding school. So I want you to know that we've experienced at least 4 or 5 generations of children, many times all from the same family. I really wanted to have Willard Jackson here from Ketchikan on our panel later this morning because I wanted him to talk about the fact that there was 3 generations of his family that attended Wrangell Institute. Willard Jackson's father, Willard himself, and Willard's son. But because of health issues, Willard can't join us today. So I'm hoping at some point that someone can capture his story and make it part of our archives. As was mentioned, I'm the first vice president of the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition, and we're in pursuit of the House Bill 5444, which is going to create the Truth and Healing Commission. And there's a Senate counterpart, I think it's 2709 or 2907. I'm dyslexic, so one of those numbers. But I digress. You can imagine it in Alaska in the 50s. It had the transportation system wasn't very good at the time, and oftentimes it took children many days to from leaving their villages to arriving at Wrangell. And I remember going to the airport in Fairbanks with my younger brother, and along the way, my mother was very tearful, She was apologetic. She said, "I'm sorry. I'm going to have to send you away." And at the time, I didn't know what that apology was all about. Until much later in life, I discovered that it was her alcoholism that caused the social workers and the Bureau of Indian Affairs to take extreme interest in my younger brother and I, and forced my mother to make a decision. Put your kids up for adoption or send them to boarding school. And she chose to send us to Wrangell Institute. And who knows what my life might have been different just from that one decision she made. The first times in our bunks, in our dorm rooms, it was military style, as I mentioned. You could see over and under to the next room. There was basically 4 bunk beds in each room, sometimes 5 bunk beds. And the littlest guys got the bottom bunks, of course, and the older kids got the top bunks. And it didn't take very long, especially at night, and especially our first night, and for the very first maybe month or two when the lights went off. All it took was one little child. Before I go further, how many people have families, children? So you probably know what a 5-year-old sounds like when their feelings get hurt. And you heard my friend on the video, Del Hayward, talking about that static breathing. Well, all it took was one little child to start crying in his bed at night, calling out for his mom. And then other children started crying in the darkness as well. And it just caught on and on and on. And pretty soon the entire little boys' dorm was kind of wailing into the night. We were all crying for our parents, all for our mothers, and for our loved ones, or maybe our appas and ammas. And we woke up the next morning and we had cried ourselves to sleep, and we could barely open our eyes. They had crusted shut from all of the tears. And that repeated itself day in and day out, night in and night out for many weeks. And I think we know as families, as parents, when a little child cries, it really wants to be loved. It wants to be held. It wants to be told that everything is okay. But nothing of that sort happened at Wrangell Institute. It was a very cold institution. Like Rose Prince said on the video, there was a manual that many matrons used. And one of the manuals was, thou shalt not show any affection to children. And so it didn't take very long for children to realize that all the crying that they were doing was going to be for naught, because it wasn't going to bring your loved one to hold you and take care of you. And I remember one matron tried valiantly to calm some children in the little boys' dorm, but there were so many of us crying that she ran out herself. She was in tears herself. She kind of saw the futility in trying to help. Another thing that happened that I want some of you may have experienced this as well, those of you who went to boarding school. We came to those schools pretty much just eating our traditional foods. And at Wrangell Institute, we were introduced to nothing but industrial cooking. they had these huge cans of salted meats, salted vegetables, sugary, what I would call, there was powdered milk, powdered eggs, powdered juice, huge batch of vegetables, of course, and fruits. And I can still remember many of the children, their bodies could not absorb that kind of food. And they became violently ill. They threw up. They had diarrhea. They had both diarrhea and throwing up and vomiting at the same time. They soiled their beds. They soiled their sheets. Matrons got really pissed off because they had to help clean it up. And they started punishing the children for being sick without understanding that it was the food that was making them so ill. And it took quite a few weeks and months for our little bodies to get acclimated to those kind of foods. A lot of us children came to Wrangell Institute bringing a lot of illness with us. And those illnesses got shared in the dorms, both in the girls' dorm and in the boys' dorm. And I can still remember waves of coughing that took over. I can remember waves of influenza, measles, mumps, chickenpox. It was really a sorry sight to see a whole bunch of us little guys all sick like that. And the worst thing of all, I think, when I was about 12 or 13, is that there was an outbreak of boils in the boys' dorm. And almost all of the boys had boils on their butts. And it was very painful. I think we overwhelmed the little clinic that was there. And that was kind of like the first year. Of course, the school itself, and the reason all of us were at that school was to assimilate us and acculturate us into the Western world, to be good little white people, as I like to say. And they used every method to encourage you from speaking your language. I saw so many acts of violence against children for simply speaking his or her language, kind of like Windy Boy there did in the video. That happened as well in Wrangell, in so many times, so many occasions. It became the norm. Being punished almost became normal. I can still remember children getting spankings from matrons, whipped by matrons. Anyone familiar with a cat of nine-tail paddle? It was a slender paddle with 9 holes in it. That's why they call it cat of nine tails. And sometimes matrons would order us to take off our clothing until we were naked, and then he would use that paddle, and sometimes with such anger and almost hatred that he raised blood blisters on the backs of our legs and backs and arms and our butts as well, which can be very dangerous. If those of you who are in the health field know that if you got too many of those kind of things can become infectious. I still remember there was a kind of a pipeline of children going back and forth between Morningside and Wrangell Institute. I remember a child coming from Morningside to Wrangell, and I didn't understand, how this person got here in the middle of the year, but he was different. I saw so many other children in my 6 years that were just there one day, and then for unknown reasons, they were just not there anymore. And we were never allowed to ask. They never told us what happened. And I'm going to talk to you more about that later on the panel for you to think about. But getting back to the educational part, everything was done by rote. Everyone had to learn their, especially the younger ones, had to learn their ABCs and their numbering system, and they had to do it in English. Everything. Even Windy Boy talked about being shamed because he had to sit up in front of the classroom and had to put on a dunce cap. Some teachers had that in our classrooms at Wrangell Institute. And so it was a shaming tool, as I said. A lot of us children who didn't know better at the time, we would kind of laugh and point and just make that little person sitting on that high stool even more ashamed of being there. So we were complicit in many ways. Also, the abuses just didn't happen with physical abuse. There was a lot of psychological abuse and emotional abuse and spiritual abuse. Because my mother still practiced a lot of her singing, dancing, and drumming, I was often told that those kind of things were satanic and evil and the works of the devil. And when you get indoctrinated by being told that during my 6 years, you start incorporating that into your own thought patterns. In 55 to 61, I can't recall all of the number of churches that were here in Wrangell, but they were often invited by the administration to come to the school, and we all got parceled out to different religious groups that were represented by the different churches here in Wrangell. I think there was efforts to make some accommodations to children where their parents may have had gone to a certain church that was available here. And then there was a lot of churches that were not here. For example, my mother was a Quaker and in a Friends church, but there were no Quakers here in Wrangell. So my younger brother and I got assigned to the Southern Baptist Church. That's in the Southern Baptist Church. And I've never been the same since. And we had religious indoctrinations faithfully Wednesday nights and Sunday mornings, ad nauseum. And we were punished for not quick enough to learn the books of the Bible, the Old and New Testaments, the Scriptures. I remember I was such a proud 12-year-old. I learned all the Old and New Testaments and all the books of the Bible. And for my reward, I got a Bible of my own with a really nice little zipper. Man, was I proud of that. Not. When I turned 16 at Mount Edgecumbe, the Southern Baptist Church there just assumed that we were going to continue our religious instructions there. But at Mount Edgecumbe, when the pastor took me out on a little ride, kind of like formally indoctrinating me into the Southern Baptist Church, He told me all the things I couldn't do. There'll be no going to movies, no dancing, no drinking, no fornicating, no. I mean, he didn't say it all at once, but over the course of this drive. And of course, he filled all the blanks in. And when we got back to the church, I said, bye. And I never went back again. That was some of the spiritual abuse I was talking to you about. A lot of many of our children came from communities where where Christianity hadn't taken that much of a hold yet, and so the practice of spirituality was very much a part of their life. And then to be forced into these churches, and by the way, my mother never gave permission for my younger brother and I to be assigned to the Southern Baptist Church. It just happened. There were other kinds of abuses, like I didn't realize this, but I wrote home about some of the things that some of the matrons were doing to us boys. And when my mom sobered up years later and she remembered my letter, she said, "You know, I got a letter from you once, but you know, I couldn't read a lot of it because it was all blacked out." And what I learned was the school was also monitoring all of our communications, all of our letters back and forth. And any writings that we had sent home about abuse were deleted. And so in my young mind, I used to think, well, I don't think my mother cares. Not understanding that she never knew why that letter I sent was blacked out, or what the contents were. One of the other abuses, of course, was sexual abuse. I'll get that. You saw that in the video. I shared some of my story on the video. There wasn't much awareness of pedophilia back in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And boarding schools were magnets to these kind of schools. And Wrangell Institute was no different. We had both men and women who liked to sexually prey on children. I saw 11, 12, 13-year-old girls going home in the middle of the school year pregnant. And they were made to be ashamed of why they had to go home. Not the perpetrator that raped them. I have a friend who was a favorite sexual toy of an administrator for all of the 8 years he was at Wrangell. He would often, she told me, call her out of her classroom. And so the administrator raped her in his office almost on a daily basis for the 8 years she was there. She developed mental illness. Those of you who are familiar or have seen or maybe even experienced cuttings on your own arms, she rolled up her sleeves and showed me the multiple scars that she had on both of her arms. And what she was doing was attempting to take the pain away from the memories of those times that she was brutally raped. She even developed a couple of extra personalities because she wanted to get out of her mind and go somewhere else while she was being abused. We were warned about the abuses we had. We were told not to tell anyone, not to tell our stories, not to tell our parents, which I did, I got blacked out. And so many of us didn't do that. We were frightened to say anything. Many of these children, as I mentioned in the video, when they got older, started abusing the younger ones as they got older. And I saw that multiple times. The physical abuse, we had a matron who loved to inflict pain on children. Today we would call that person a sadist. He took a friend and me into the shower room, forced us to get undressed, and he blocked the shower door with his body, and on the side of the door he pulled out a fire hose, and he turned the fire hose on my friend and I. And that streaming water was just so cold and so biting. It literally took our breath away. We could barely breathe. And we tried to run around inside the shower room to escape that hose, but he just followed us around. My friend had two ear infections, one in each ear, and that cold, biting water penetrated into his eardrums, and he was screaming. The gauntlet, we ran the gauntlet too, and I still remember, and it became a spectator sport. Let me tell you that much. It was often on a weekend, and matrons and teachers, administrators, all came to the boys' dorm to watch the spectacle of little, 5, 6, 7, 8-year-olds getting naked and running up and down a line of boys that were instructed to use their belts on each other, on them that ran up. And a lot of times, it wasn't just one time. Sometimes we were ordered to run back and forth. And so we were hit multiple times. Some kids used the buckle end of their belts, and they used them so hard that it raised, again, it drew blood. I still remember some defiance in some of the boys who refused to cry and refused to run, but he would walk. And he would get hit. And he'd turn around and he'd walk again. And he'd get hit. And that just pissed off the matrons to no end, especially the sadist. I had a dear friend who was hit so hard by this same guy, that he broke his jaw open, and he splayed his mouth open all the way to underneath his ear, and half of his face fell open. He was instantly unconscious. He was bleeding profusely on the floor. And so many of us children watched this violence from this matron. And he was taken to the hospital. He came back a week or so later, and his mouth was wired shut. He could only eat and drink out of a straw for almost a couple of months. And that, my friend, was a daily reminder of what a matron could get away with. The matron was never fired, never punished, never went to jail, and he lived to terrorize other boarding schools during the time he spent his career there. Like in the video, when I got older, I didn't know what it was like to be a parent, and I have 3 children. I didn't know how to parent them. I mean, I could kind of relate to them until they were 8 years old, and they were around while they were children growing up, and then I could relate to them again after they turned 18. But thank goodness for my wife Susan, who was able to take care of our kids for that time period, because I did not know how to be a parent. If anything, I tried to punish my 2 older boys, the way I was punished at Wrangell. And I was using my belt on them. And Susan came from a loving village who didn't do those kind of things. And she put her foot down. And I was a pretty abusive husband and father. And she told me to go get help because I was very much an angry person. I could, in my early years, metaphorically, I could put a chip on either shoulder and just walk around and wait for someone to try to knock it off. Because that's how much the anger in me was so great. I even wanted to come down here and kill that sadist. I had visions of bringing a pistol down here and just offing that mother. That's how angry I was. Then, of course, I was gently reminded that you don't do those kind of things. So my next fantasy was to look in the obituaries to see if his name showed up. And it did, but I missed it. Some other boarding school student found it. I was envious. But I did go get help. I went to therapy. I discovered the source of my anger. I discovered the source of being abused in so many different ways when I was at Wrangell, and that it wasn't my fault. I went to individual therapy. I went to talking circles. I went to Beauty for Ashes. Some of you may have heard of that term, Beauty for Ashes. It's a faith-based program, believe it or not, that allows adults who were abused as children to share their stories with compassionate and caring therapists and counselors available. And we stayed on that campus for 5 days, just kind of unloading all of those things we experienced as children. And I felt the whole world lifted off my shoulders. And then I thought a little bit, and I thought, I could probably go back because I'm still healing. My experiences got even more heightened when Tony Knowles appointed me as the Rural Affairs Coordinator for the Department of Corrections in the mid-90s. And I spent 4.5 years working with Native inmates and their families and Native organizations, trying to help them navigate the criminal justice system in Alaska. And in my mind, I see that as just an extension of the boarding school era. Our Native inmates are still going to boarding school, but in prison. I started to see a lot more of myself in them, because I would sometimes think, but for the grace of God go I could have been one of those inmates. Oh, thank you. What? There's no whiskey? No. And then I discovered, we make up maybe 20% of Alaska's population. We are represented in the criminal justice system at 40%, twice our numbers. Think about it. The cops, the state troopers, BPSOs, they all have a hand in arresting and sending people to trial, where we are tried by a third party. We're tried by a lot of times a public defender who doesn't know anything about culture. We're prosecuted by a group of people who do not understand our culture. We're sentenced by a court that doesn't understand our culture. And yet, before contact, we didn't have these kinds of things before us. So we're still experiencing these kind of traumas even today. So think about it, 40% of our criminal justice population is incarcerated. I even had to go down to Arizona, where our contract jail was, to spend time with almost 400 Alaska Native inmates. And I brought them Native food, which they loved. But I did that with all 12 institutions in Alaska. I did at least twice a year. I would go to Ketchikan Indian Correctional Center, Lemon Creek, the one in Seward, the one in Kenai, the one in Fairbanks, Nome, Bethel. And Bethel even has about a 95% Native incarceration rate just at that facility. %60 of our children, our Native children that are in foster care today in Alaska, are Alaska Native children. 60%. We have the highest rates of suicides, domestic violence, accidental death than almost any other ethnic group in America. And you have to ask yourself, why is that? The only thing a group of us could think of was we almost, to a person, we all had relatives or ourselves were sent to boarding school, where we learned all these behaviors. And we tried to numb ourselves with alcohol and drugs to take away the pain and memory of our experiences. And then we would get into trouble. So the cycle is repeating itself. I started attempting to educate the correctional officers and probation and parole officers, including the State Troopers Academy in Sitka, by providing cultural awareness training, because most of these people in these professions are non-Native people. They don't know anything about who we are as Native people. And I tried to educate them as the best I could. But after I left, there was a new governor, and the new governor just took it away, just like that. Boom. So we're almost kind of back where we started. I had the great fortune of becoming a term instructor at the University of Alaska Anchorage in the Alaska Native Studies Department. And I noticed that there was no curriculum that had anything to do with teaching us about our history, our Native history. Boy, I didn't know it. But slowly and surely, I developed the curriculum to include some of the traumas we experience, such as all of those illnesses and deaths that our ancestors and our great-grandparents and grandparents most likely experienced. And then, of course, that was traumatic in and of itself. Then, of course, there was boarding school. There was nothing in our classrooms about any of that. And so it was a combination of going through my own self-healing and teaching about our history that I started going out into our society and sharing more and more of our story. And I was always hoping there would be a national organization that could help address these things that were happening in our state. And lo and behold, I learned about the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition. And I said, can I join? But not only can I join, can I be a board member? And I was accepted in 2017. I'll be finishing up my 5th year in November, and I'll be termed out next year. So I want to use the time that I have to share as much of our story and our history, because it is this national group that is also taking the lead in working with our congressional supporters and our national offices like the Department of Interior. We just have a wonderful group of leaders that are all coalescing together to try to make some changes to all of these things that I've been sharing with you today. And we'll have more of discussions by Teresa Sheldon. Teresa, could you stand up? She is going to be talking about more about what our national office is doing, and it's headquartered in Minneapolis. Thanks, Teresa. Slowly but surely, I noticed that without much fanfare, without much notice, there are literally dozens and dozens of communities and organizations healing or on their way to healing on their own. They're developing their own language revitalization programs. They're going to spirit camps and culture camps and having gatherings with their elders and bringing back singing, dancing, and drumming. My own region of my mother, who came from the Nana region, it was only a few years ago, after 100 years of being told by the Quakers that they could not practice their traditional singing, dancing, and drumming, the elders of some of these villages are now saying it's okay to return and to bring back what was not practiced for so long. There's a very famous one, I think, in either Inupiaq or Inupiaq country called the wolf dance that has been brought back. That was banned for a long time. Maybe Sophie Jenkins can talk to us about that. And she'll be on our panel today. Sophie, could you stand up? Yeah, could you stand? She's from Bethel, and she'll be talking to us about traditional healing methods from that neck of the woods. And I think one of the things that we need to work on together is something really near and dear to my heart, and that has to do with forgiveness. However, in order to have forgiveness, we need to share our stories about how we may have been involved with the boarding school era, how we may have participated, how we may have benefited, how we may have tried to do our own healing. And I have a thing that I'm working on in my head. It has to do with Wrangell was just 5 miles away. And I've often wondered, what did the town of Wrangell do to help us to experience those things in that school? Did they know? And if they knew, what did they try to do anything? And I think there are many dozens of towns across America that were nearby boarding schools that may have to come to terms with their own history as well. So I don't want to single Wrangell out in particular, but we're here. But I want you to know that it's happening all across the country. And we still need to hold each other accountable for what happened. Personally, I have forgiven all of my tormentors. I've forgiven all the ones who beat me. But I also wanted to share the story to let you know what happened, because our voices were not heard for so long. I really got to thank people like Ethan Pettigrew and Miranda and some of the other presenters, because they were so eloquent in ways of explaining and exposing this historical trauma, but also in ways that we can educate our children in a way that their identity is strong. And of course, I'm still learning. I'm 75 years old, and I'm still trying to learn what it's like to be an Inupiaq. Thank you very much.